He had to admit that there was a moment of panic. He was looking at the New York Times on April 11, 1857, when he saw that article, an article about savages, Indians, somewhere in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota, killing settlers, slaughtering them. Somebody by the name of Inkpaduta. He wasn't worried about those poor white settlers that were killed by the Indians. He was worried about himself and his business. He was a rich man living in New York, and he wanted to stay that way. He made that money as a land speculator, the land in Minnesota and Iowa. Using his significant political connections, he was part of that whole conspiracy to force the Dakota Sioux to sell their land to the U.S. government and then move on to that reservation in Minnesota. And then as a land speculator, he swooped in, bought the land from the U.S. government for next to nothing, and then promoted it to people who might want to move out west and settle. And when they did, then he sold that land to the settlers for a higher, much higher price. He made a lot of money. And hostiles, savages killing settlers in that area was not good for business. But his panic was temporary because he quickly came to the conclusion that the government out there, the military, they would take care of this. They would kill that Inkpaduta, or they would capture him and then kill him. So he sat back and had another whiskey cocktail, which these days is called an old-fashioned. On that same date, at that same time, at about 1,160 miles due west of New York as the crow flies, Inkpaduta was riding a horse, much like this, that he had taken from the settlers at Springfield. He was leading his people west, away from the whites. He wasn't aware that he made the papers in the big city of New York because, frankly, he didn't know that a place like New York even existed and probably wouldn't have cared. But news moved quickly in the Dakota world, and he must have known that Minnesota, Iowa, western Wisconsin, they were in a panic. They thought that there were hordes of Sioux on the warpath. Thousands of settlers fled to larger towns. Militias were formed to repel the Indian hordes. Newspapers in the Midwest talked about Mankato and St. Peter destroyed by Sioux. 5,000 to 6,000 Sioux were approaching Fort Dodge, and then later it was reported that all of Fort Dodge had been massacred. There were reports that Fort Ridgely had been taken by the Sioux. There were calls for the army to find and capture and destroy Inkpaduta. Throughout, Inkpaduta was vilified as one of the most bloodthirsty Indian leaders in the Northwest. He was now the boogeyman of the frontier. Although we don't know exactly what he looked like, to the whites on the frontier, he assumed this persona. This is what he looked like to them in their minds. But you know that guy in New York, that rich guy? He was wrong. Nobody would kill Inkpaduta. Nobody would capture him. And he would live as a free man until the day he died of natural causes, some 24 years later. 13-year-old Abbie Gardner and the other 3 young women who were captive, for them, the trip to the west with Inkpaduta and his band was brutal. The weather was changing. It was now April, but there was still some of this. And plenty of this. For Abbie and the other captives, it was difficult to walk through the snow. The Dakota used snowshoes. The captives had none. Abbie and the others carried backpacks, which she later found out weighed 70 pounds. They often had to walk through waist-deep water. It was cold. Their clothing stayed wet and frozen most of the time. They were running out of the food taken from the settlers, and they were eating any of the small game they could find, often without cooking it. The horses were starving. If they died, they too were eaten. 17-year-old Margaret Marble was having an especially difficult time carrying the heavy load through the heavy snow. But it was 19-year-old Elizabeth Thatcher that was the most worrisome. She was cold all the time. She developed phlebitis. According to Abbie, one of her breasts gathered and burst. One arm swelled up to twice its size and turned black. She should have been getting medical care. Yet, like all the other captives, she had to walk all day with the heavy load, wade through ice-cold streams, chop and carry wood at night, cut poles, put up teepees, make something to eat, and do whatever any of the men in the band ordered her to do, and then do it all again the next day. The fourth captive, 20-year-old Lydia Noble, well, she just seemed to be losing her mind. This is the route that Inkpaduta used to get from Lake Huron, just outside Springfield, Minnesota, to Redfield, South Dakota. The distance is 191 miles, and it took Inkpaduta about 2 months to cover that distance. The first half of the trip, winter conditions. The second half, spring-like conditions, meaning mud and rain. The stop at present-day Pipestone, Minnesota, was at the ancient quarry known as Abbie. For centuries, American Indians had been coming to this quarry to mine the soft red stone used to carve ceremonial pipes like this one. Even though Inkpaduta was only 55 miles away from Lake Huron, the place he was camped when he attacked Springfield, he must have felt safe because he stayed here in Pipestone at that quarry for 3 to 4 days before moving on. And then when he did move on, he only moved 15 miles to the town now known as Flandreau, South Dakota. And this is the place where Elizabeth Thatcher was murdered. After leaving Pipestone, the group traveled another 15 miles or so west. They now had been marching through open, trackless prairie for about 6 weeks in the winter, through deep snow, sloughs, rivers, ponds. It must have been miserable. And they finally come to the Big Sioux River in a place where the city of Flandreau, South Dakota, is now located. And here, something terrible happened. You recall those 4 paintings that Abbie had commissioned later in her life to chronicle what she saw at various times during her captivity? This is another one of those paintings, and it tells the story of the death of Elizabeth Thatcher. Inkpaduta and his people were using a boom to cross the Big Sioux River. A boom is a place where trees have fallen down across the river and create a natural bridge. The Dakota had become frustrated with Elizabeth Thatcher. She was always ill, and she was slow. Abbie was walking in front of Elizabeth as they were crossing the boom. A young Dakota, 16-year-old boy, came up to Elizabeth and removed the pack from Elizabeth Thatcher's back and put it on his own back. According to Abbie, Elizabeth seemed to know that she was going to die. She said goodbye to Abbie and asked Abbie to tell her family that she, quote, desired to live and escape for their sake. Halfway across the boom, the same 16-year-old Dakota boy pushed Elizabeth off the boom into the water. At first, she was able to swim to the opposite shore, but when she reached that shore, she was beaten back by Dakota men and boys with sticks and rocks. She then swam back to the other shoreline, the eastern shoreline, and when she got there, she was met again by men with clubs. And then at that point, 19-year-old Elizabeth Thatcher, who had seen her 3-week-old baby girl Dora killed on day 2 of the Spirit Lake Massacre, was shot to death, and her body drifted on downstream. And 13-year-old Abbie Gardner, she saw it all. The next morning, Inkpaduta moved his band again to the west and eventually came to present-day Madison, South Dakota, where they set up camp next to Skunk Lake, now known as Lake Herman. The band arrived here on May 6, 1857, 59 days after the massacre began in Spirit Lake. They only had 1 horse left. They had eaten the other 11 horses on the way. Something good actually happened here. You remember the reservation in Minnesota and the location of the Lower Sioux Agency? 2 Christian Sioux brothers, Sounding Heaven and Grayfoot, were recruited by Major Charles Flandreau, the U.S. Indian agent for the Sioux Reservation. Their mission, find Inkpaduta and using trade goods, buy all of the captives. And so the 2 men traveled from the Lower Sioux Agency in Minnesota, found Inkpaduta at Skunk Lake, and offered to buy the 3 remaining captives. They found out they could only afford 1. And so the 2 men went to the teepee where the captives were kept to choose the one that they would purchase. They decided to look for the one that seemed to need the most help. And so they asked Lydia Noble to come with them. She cowered, became angry, and refused to go with them. Then they summoned Margaret Marble, and she was eager to go with the 2 men. The 2 men would later say that they did not choose Abbie because she was younger, and for that reason she might escape the harsh treatment received by the others. The 2 men were able to get Margaret Marble to the Lower Sioux Agency and then on to St. Paul, Minnesota, where she was greeted by hundreds and hundreds of well-wishers, congratulations and sympathies. In fact, the people of St. Paul gave Margaret Marble $1,000, the equivalent of $36,000 today. And the 2 brothers, the rescuers, they were given $500 each, which is the equivalent of $18,000 today. Back in Inkpaduta's camp, it was just Abbie and Lydia Noble now. And Inkpaduta was on the move, heading towards what is now Redfield, South Dakota. Several things happened on this 92-mile trip to Redfield. First, one of the Dakota Sioux babies died, and the grief that Abbie witnessed was overwhelming. The mother of the child cut off her hair and broke out into a song of death. The father seized his gun and ran off into the prairie, apparently to kill himself. Other Dakota men had to find him and bring him back. A death song, wild and unearthly and described as hideous by Abbie, rang out every night at the same time for several weeks. The mother would begin and others would join in. After the baby's death, the baby was carried for several days, closely wrapped in a blanket. And when they reached the desired grove, a platform was made, and the baby was laid to rest on that platform. The mystery for Abbie, and maybe for all of us, is how could these people, this man, love and grieve the loss of their child like that, when just weeks earlier they were killing the children of white settlers? I guess that question will have to remain rhetorical for me because I don't know the answer. The second thing that happened on that trip to Redfield is that Inkpaduta sold both Abbie and Lydia Noble to a Yankton Sioux by the name of End of the Snake. End of the Snake was hobbled. He had one leg basically and spent most of the time on his horse. And as a result, Abbie had to fetch game for him as he shot that game. End of the Snake and Abbie and Lydia stayed with Inkpaduta's band as they moved on towards Redfield. The third thing that happened on this trip, the trip to Redfield, was horrendous. One night, as Abbie and Lydia Noble were about to lie down to go to sleep in the teepee, a son of Inkpaduta by the name of Roaring Cloud entered the teepee and ordered Lydia Noble out. He intended to assault her. She had resisted before, but this time she refused. Roaring Cloud dragged her out of the teepee and, using a piece of firewood from nearby the teepee, he hit her 3 times in the head. Then he re-entered the teepee, washed his bloody hands, had a few words with End of the Snake, and laid down to sleep. For hours, Abbie could hear Lydia Noble groaning outside until finally there was silence. Abbie was unable to go to her aid because if she had, she would have met the same fate. Lydia Noble was 20 years old, tall, slender, and graceful, and a Christian. She had a sister and 2 brothers living in Hampton, Iowa. The next morning, warriors gathered around the mangled corpse outside the teepee and used it as a target. They mutilated the body with knives. They scalped her. A little later, they broke camp. As they marched along, one young Dakota boy had Lydia Noble's long braids tied to a stick, and he repeatedly slashed Abbie in the face with it in a way to mock her. Lydia was left lying on the prairie. Inkpaduta and his band and Abbie, they arrived at Turtle Creek near present Redfield, South Dakota in late May of 1857. And that was the location of a very large Yankton Sioux camp, 190 or so teepees, 2,000 or more Yankton Sioux there. And they were described as wild Indians. They had no white man products. Bows and arrows were their weapons. And Abbie was probably the first white they had ever seen. They were very curious about her, and morning to night, they would come into her teepee to look at her white skin, her hair, and her blue eyes. And for Abbie, in this wild environment, far from any of her people, she thought all was lost. She thought she would never be saved. And then, on May 30, 1857, 83 days after the start of the massacre in Spirit Lake, Iowa, 3 men wearing coats and white shirts entered her teepee. They were Christian Indians from the reservation in Minnesota, and they were there for Abbie.